exposing hypocrisy, bad faith arguments, and outright lies. This is Agora America.
You know, it's easy to think that how we teach kids is, well, just how it's always been done. But what if it isn't? Today, we're going to dive into a report that lays out a pretty incredible argument that the American education system has been methodically reshaped over the last 60 years. The report calls it an architecture of change, and we're going to walk through the 4 phases it describes.
All right, so how does a big change like this even happen? According to this report, it's a 4-step process. First, you need a new idea, a whole new philosophy of what education is for. Then you turn that philosophy into the actual rules of the game. Next up, you shape who gets to be a teacher. And the final piece, you bake it all right into the textbooks.
So let's rewind the clock. The analysis we're looking at pinpoints the start of all this to the mid-1960s, and it zeroes in on one place in particular: Columbia University's Teachers College. This, the report argues, is where the whole idea of what a teacher is supposed to do really started to change.
And right at the heart of this shift, the report puts a spotlight on a philosopher named Maxine Greene. She joins the faculty there in 1965, and her ideas, well, they start to poke holes in a very old and very established concept: the idea that education should be neutral.
This is really the crux of it, right here. The report points to this idea that teachers should inject themselves into the process. And let's be clear, this wasn't just about being more passionate in the classroom. The analysis says this was a fundamental break from the old model of objective teaching. It was about seeing the teacher's role as something much more activist.
So what was the intellectual engine for this? The report says it was a concept Greene called wide awakenness. I know, it sounds a little out there, but what it really did, according to this analysis, was give teachers a kind of intellectual permission slip. Permission to go beyond just the facts and figures, and instead to actively critique society as it is, and to start pushing students to imagine a world that is not yet.
Okay, so you had this new philosophical seed planted at Columbia, and it didn't take long for it to find some powerful fertilizer from abroad. The report points specifically to a Brazilian thinker, Paulo Freire. His book, it says, was like throwing gasoline on the fire. Freire had this really catchy term for the old way of doing things, the banking method, where the teacher just deposits knowledge into the student's brain. But here's the kicker. The report stresses that Freire didn't just think this was a bad way to learn. He called it an act of oppression. Suddenly, the classroom isn't just a classroom. In this new framework, it's a political arena, a struggle between the powerful and the powerless.
So, you've got these really potent ideas brewing in academia, but how do they actually get into your local elementary school? Well, that brings us to phase 2 of the report's timeline. This is the part where the philosophy gets turned into policy, where the ideas become the rules.
And this didn't happen overnight. The source lays out this long game played out over decades. You see major professional groups, think the National Council of Teachers of English, and big unions like the NEA, starting to weave these new ideas into their official guidelines and standards. And often, the report notes, this was helped along with some serious cash from big foundations.
I mean, look at this. This is a perfect example of what the report is talking about. The main professional group for English teachers flat out states that its mission includes disrupting hierarchies of power. Think about that for a second. The goal shifts from, say, teaching grammar and Shakespeare to something explicitly political.
And as we mentioned, money played a big role here. The report points to a massive influx of funding that helped push this transition along. We're talking about $4.2 million from just the Ford Foundation alone in the early 90s, all earmarked for these new diversity and equity programs. That kind of money can definitely grease the wheels for change.
Okay, so the rules of the game have been rewritten. What's the next logical step? Well, according to this analysis, you change who gets to be a player. The new standards started to act like a filter on the teacher pipeline itself, leading to what the report calls a more homogeneous, ideologically similar teaching force.
And the report tries to put some numbers on this. It draws a pretty stark contrast over about 50 years. It cites data saying that back in 1968, around a third of teachers would have called themselves left-leaning. Fast forward to today, and it points to different data suggesting that more than 60% of K-12 educators voted for the Democratic presidential candidate. That's a huge demographic shift.
So what's the mechanism here? How does this filtering actually work? The report focuses on one tool in particular: the rise of diversity, equity, and inclusion statements. You probably heard them called DEI statements. They became common in hiring for university professors, the very people who train our future K-12 teachers. The argument presented is that these statements ended up working like a political litmus test, making sure new hires were already on board with a certain perspective.
And that brings us to the end game, the fourth and final phase in this architectural plan. This is where it all comes home to roost, embedding these ideas not just in the teachers, but directly into the curriculum, right into what students are required to learn every day.
The report holds up California's Ethnic Studies Model Curriculum as Exhibit A. It argues this is a clear case of putting the tools of critical theory, which in a nutshell is all about looking at society through the lens of power and oppression, and putting them directly into required lessons for high schoolers.
So what does that actually look like in a classroom? Well, students are taught to take any story or historical account, what the curriculum calls a dominant narrative, and basically put it on trial. They're given a set of key questions to ask. The first one is,
Next up, the second question they're trying to ask is,
And the third and final question. So you can see the pattern here. The report's takeaway is that this isn't just one lesson, it's a whole new way of thinking. It's designed to make these tools of critical analysis the default lens through which students see the world.
To really drive the point home, the report wraps everything up with this powerful side-by-side comparison. It's like a before and after of the educational worldview. On the one hand, you have 1965, where the focus was on acquiring knowledge. On the other, 2025, where the focus is on deconstructing power. Look at the view of authority. It shifts from something seen as flawed but necessary to something seen as an inherent system of exploitation.
So there you have it. The report lays out this detailed 60-year blueprint for change. It's a compelling, step-by-step account of a massive ideological shift. And it really leaves us with one big, looming question to think about. If this analysis is accurate, what kind of citizens is this new architecture designed to build?
This is Agora America.